Have you ever sat quietly after a conversation with your grown child, staring at your hands, wondering how the tone between you became so sharp, so cold? Maybe they snapped at you for offering advice. Maybe they rolled their eyes when you asked about their weekend plans. Or maybe they just didn't show up at all. Not in presence, not in spirit, not even in voice. And you were left sitting there, not angry exactly, but aching. A kind of ache that's hard to explain. Because it's not about one moment. It's about the slow erosion of something sacred. Respect? If you felt that if you've left a phone call or a family gathering and thought, did they really just speak to me like that? You're not alone, and you're not imagining it. You're a parent. You raised them. You gave them your energy, your sleepless nights, your best years. You weren't perfect. No one is. But you loved them with a depth they may never fully understand. And yet now, it sometimes feels like you have to earn their respect, or worse, beg for it. That's not how it should be. But before we go too far, let's pause for a moment not to blame them, and not to blame yourself. Either let's just breathe together and face the truth that many loving parents over 60 are silently carrying. They don't feel respected by their adult children anymore. And what do you do with that? You could complain. You could tell them how hurt you are. You could try to make them see, but you've probably already learned the hard way it rarely works. Words that come from pain are often dismissed. Emotions that aren't invited are too easily labeled as drama, nagging, or guilt trips. So you stay quiet. You nod. You pretend it doesn't hurt. But inside, it does. And over time, that silence becomes its own kind of prison. But what if the way forward isn't louder words, but different actions? What if it's not about complaining, but about changing how you show up? Frank is 72, his daughter. Emily is sharp, ambitious, and very busy. When she calls, she often dominates the conversation, cutting him off, correcting him, giving advice he never asked for. Frank used to nod and say nothing. He told himself, that's just how she is. But each call left him feeling smaller, like his opinions didn't count anymore. Then one day, after a particularly dismissive remark about his health choices, Frank didn't argue. He didn't defend. He simply said, Emily, I love you, and I trust myself to make the decisions that are right for me. I'm not asking for your permission. It wasn't loud. It wasn't mean, but it was firm. And for the first time in years, Emily stopped talking. She listened. That was the first quiet shift, holding firm without needing approval. When you stop chasing your child's validation, they start noticing your presence in a different way, not as someone to manage, but someone to meet. Margaret, a retired teacher and mother of 3, had a different story. Her oldest son, Jack, always joked that she was forgetful or too emotional. He'd say things like, don't worry, Mom, we'll handle the grown-up stuff. She used to laugh along, not wanting to seem too sensitive. But one day, after being talked over yet again during a family gathering, she decided she'd had enough. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply stood up, walked over to Jack, looked him in the eye, and said, I'm not a punchline. I'm your mother, and I won't be talked about that way. There was silence. And that silence held more weight than any argument ever could. Because Margaret wasn't reacting from hurt. She was standing in her dignity. And that's the second quiet shift. Refusing to participate in your own belittling. You don't have to explain your value. You just have to live it. And when you do, it changes the dynamic, not always overnight. And not always perfectly, but enough. Helen, 74, had spent years doing everything she could to stay in her children's good graces. She babysat. She loaned money. She cooked and cleaned and drove long distances just to be helpful. But the more she gave, the less they seemed to appreciate it. They began to expect it, even demand it. She felt resentful, but she never said anything. Until one day, her body said what her mouth wouldn't. After a bout of exhaustion landed her in bed for a week, she realized, I've been trying to buy their respect with service, and it's made me disappear. That's when she made a decision. She began to do less, but with more clarity. She told her daughter, I love helping you, but I won't say yes to things that leave me depleted. It was uncomfortable. Her daughter pushed back at first, but Helen stayed calm. She didn't complain. She didn't defend. She just held her ground. And a few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Her daughter thanked her. "Mom," she said, "I didn't realize how much I was leaning on you. I'm sorry. You deserve rest too." That moment came not because Helen demanded it, but because she modeled what self-respect looks like. And that's where the shift begins. Not by shouting, not by scolding, but by quietly deciding, "I will not abandon myself to win your love. I will stand in who I am, and let that be enough." There's a deep ache that settles in when you realize the respect you thought was unspoken no longer exists, and often it doesn't come in the form of shouting or name-calling. It comes in the quiet dismissals, the impatient sighs, the way your voice is talked over at the dinner table, the way your needs are pushed to the back of the list if they're acknowledged at all. It's easy to wonder how it got this way, and sometimes we blame ourselves. We wonder if we were too soft, too giving, too available, and maybe, in small ways, we were. But let's pause right here and make something clear. The love you gave was never the mistake. The mistake, if there was one, was believing that love had to be earned by sacrificing yourself. You are not respected less because you were too kind. You are respected less when that kindness came without boundaries, when yes became automatic, when it's okay became the way you swallowed every bruise to your dignity. That's not a failure. That's what you were taught. Many of us were to keep the peace, to be easygoing, to expect less as we age. But we are still allowed to change that story, even now. Ethan is 67. He was the type of father who never missed a recital, a school meeting, or a sick day. Now, his adult son Caleb lives close by, but when Ethan asked if they could have lunch together once a week, Caleb shrugged and said, "I'm too busy. Maybe you can just come by and watch the kids instead." Ethan didn't respond with anger, but he didn't say yes either. He paused, and then, for the first time in their adult relationship, he said, "I'm not just here to be useful. I'm here to be with you." Caleb was quiet, confused, maybe, but something shifted. That one sentence landed heavier than any complaint could have, because Ethan wasn't begging. He was honoring himself. That's where the deepest kind of change begins, not in correcting our children, but in correcting our own patterns, the ones where we confuse being helpful with being lovable. When you let go of the idea that your worth is tied to your usefulness, you begin to move differently. You start asking yourself questions you haven't asked in years. Do I actually want to do this? Or am I afraid of what will happen if I say no? Do I speak up when I feel dismissed? Or do I pretend it didn't happen so they'll keep coming around? Am I respecting myself the way I want them to respect me? Frank once said something after his son barked at him for forgetting a minor detail. He didn't yell. He didn't defend. He simply replied, "You may speak to others that way, but I won't accept it for myself." It took courage. But more than that, it took clarity. That's one of the most powerful things we can give ourselves in this season of life. Clarity without apology. You don't have to justify why you want to be spoken to with kindness. You don't have to explain why your time matters. You don't have to plead to be treated with the very respect you once taught them to show. And yet, many of us find ourselves doing just that, explaining, softening, avoiding conflict. Helen, for years, would brush off little jabs from her daughter. "You always overthink everything, Mom." Or, "You're too sensitive." She'd laugh nervously, change the subject, pretend she wasn't hurt. But inside, the hurt piled up. It wasn't until she began therapy through a local senior center that she found words for what was happening. Emotional minimization. She was being quietly erased not through cruelty, but through casual disregard. And when she finally began to see it, she did something new. She didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She simply stopped pretending she was okay with it. The next time her daughter spoke sharply, Helen paused and said, "That doesn't sit right with me. I'd appreciate it if we spoke more gently." There was a long pause, but her daughter didn't walk away. In fact, she softened, because sometimes our silence teaches others to keep overstepping, And our gentle truth teaches them where we begin. That's not control. That's not defiance. That's dignity. And it brings us to something essential. Your energy teaches others how to treat you. If your energy says, I will do anything to stay close, they will take. If your energy says, I'm afraid to upset you, they will push. But if your energy says, I am here, I am whole, and I will not abandon myself, something changes in the air. They might test it. They might resist. But deep down, they notice. And even if it takes time, they begin to respond not to the noise, but to the steady presence of someone who is no longer available for disrespect. Grace experienced this the hard way. Her adult children rarely included her in decisions, often telling her what was best for her as if she couldn't think for herself. One day, after being left out of a major family vacation plan, she didn't cry or complain. She didn't write a letter or make a dramatic phone call. She just planned her own trip, took a train to the mountains, stayed 3 nights, walked through pine trails, ate alone at a cafe with a mountain view, and when her children finally called, confused and a little guilty, she simply said, I decided not to wait for respect. I gave myself what I needed. It stunned them. But more than that, it taught them, because respect doesn't start with others. It starts with you. It's a quiet kind of power the moment you stop explaining yourself and start simply being yourself. For many parents over 60, this shift doesn't arrive with fanfare. There are no fireworks, no grand confrontations. It's subtle, almost invisible, but it begins the moment you decide that your dignity is not up for discussion, that your worth is not dependent on their tone, their attention, or even their approval. And when that change happens in you, others begin to feel it. Emily always saw her mother, Margaret, as the soft one, the one who kept the peace, said yes to every request, and never pushed back. When Emily started raising her own children, she began treating her mother more like a service provider than a parent dropping the kids off without notice, asking for help but not offering conversation, and growing distant in emotional moments. For years, Margaret tolerated it, not because she liked it, but because she feared losing even those fragments of connection. But one morning, standing by the window with a cup of tea in hand, Margaret realized something. She wasn't respected because she was always available. She was tolerated because she never asked for more. That realization didn't make her bitter. It made her awake. So the next time Emily called, Margaret didn't make excuses. She said, "Today won't work for me." When Emily asked why, expecting a justification, Margaret simply said, "Because I have other plans." With myself, it wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a test. It was a moment of truth. And it marked a shift not just in Margaret's schedule, but in her spirit. Because when you live with self-respect, you stop trying to be seen and start seeing yourself. There's a beauty that returns to your life when you step out of emotional servitude. It's the return of choice, the rediscovery of your own preferences, your own pace, your own joy. Jack, a widower in his early 70s, had spent years trying to earn back the closeness he once had with his daughter. She had grown cold after her mother's death, and Jack, consumed by guilt for not always being emotionally present during her childhood, tried to make up for it in retirement, gifts, favors, unspoken forgiveness. But the dynamic didn't shift. If anything, she began to treat him more like an obligation than a person. Then one day, while tending to his small garden, Jack paused and asked himself a question he hadn't asked in years. What do I want? It was so simple, and yet so unfamiliar. That question unlocked something in him. He started reading again, traveling to small towns with scenic trains, taking himself out to lunch, and slowly but noticeably his posture changed. He no longer approached conversations from a place of guilt. He started bringing his full presence to the table not as someone seeking forgiveness, but as someone offering connection. His daughter noticed, not immediately, not dramatically, but she began asking more questions. She started calling without a reason, and one evening, over dinner, she said, "You seem lighter, happier." Jack smiled. "I stopped waiting for your permission to live." That's what emotional restoration looks like. Not in fixing others, but in freeing yourself. Because respect doesn't bloom from resentment. It grows from self-honoring. Sophie had a similar story. Her son had developed a habit of making jokes about her old-fashioned ways. He teased her about her clothes, her recipes, even her handwriting. At first, she laughed along, thinking it would bring them closer. But over time, she began to feel like a caricature in her own family, so she stopped laughing. The next time he made a comment about her vintage voice, she smiled gently and said, "I'm proud of my voice. It carries years of stories you haven't even heard yet." There was a pause. Her son looked confused, but something shifted because dignity, when spoken softly, can echo louder than sarcasm. You don't have to fight for a seat at the table. You just have to stop shrinking in your own chair. These small changes, saying no without anger, speaking up without fear, doing things for yourself without apology, they begin to weave a different story in your life. One where your presence commands respect, not by force, but by clarity. And the irony, when you stop seeking their love like oxygen, they begin to breathe you in differently. You're no longer the person trying to be accepted. You are the person standing in quiet wholeness. And that more than lectures, guilt or silent suffering is what begins to shift the room. Your children might not say it out loud, but they feel it. That new steadiness in your voice, that peaceful strength in your decisions, that softness that is no longer tied to servitude, but grounded in self-awareness. And even if they never change, you do. You feel less fragile, less anxious, less desperate to decode their moods, because you've come home to yourself. It's not that you stop loving them. It's that you stop leaving yourself to love them. And from that place, real connection becomes possible, not the kind built on obligation or guilt, but the kind built on mutual respect, because you no longer have to be loud to be heard. You no longer have to be needed to be worthy. You no longer have to be perfect to be treated with care. You only need to stand, gently but firmly, in your light. Thank you for being here with me. Truly. If you've made it this far into our conversation, I want you to know something important. You are not invisible. You are not alone. And your presence, your story, your quiet strength, it matters more than you may realize. So many people walk through life thinking they're the only ones carrying this ache, the only ones wondering, why did my child stop listening? Why does it feel like I don't matter anymore? Why does love feel so one-sided now? But here you are, and your willingness to explore these feelings, to ask the deeper questions, to reflect, to quietly reclaim your space, that is not weakness. That is grace. That is courage. I know there are days when you might feel forgotten, when you hear more about what you shouldn't expect than what you deserve, when all the sacrifices you made seem to vanish into thin air. But let me remind you, the love you gave was real. The moments you stayed up late, the times you said yes when you were tired, the times you held in your tears so others could be strong, all of that still lives. It shaped your family. It shaped your children, even if they can't fully see it yet. And you are still here, still learning, still growing, still capable of a deep, fulfilling peace. There's a quiet power that comes when you stop trying to prove yourself, when you no longer chase after validation or wait for someone to treat you with dignity before you offer it to yourself, when you stop walking on eggshells around your adult children and start walking in the fullness of who you are. You don't have to harden your heart to protect it. You don't need to become cold or cut ties completely. You simply need to return to yourself, to remember that you are not here to be tolerated. You are here to live. What would it feel like to wake up and do something that's just for you? Not to be useful, not to be productive, not to make someone else's life easier, but because it brings you joy. Maybe it's sitting under the sun with a good book. Maybe it's writing letters you never send. Maybe it's planting flowers you've always loved, even if no one else notices them bloom. That is not selfishness. That is restoration. And maybe, just maybe, the more you pour back into yourself, the more those around you begin to notice what was always true, that your presence has value with or without their approval. If this message touched something in you, if it stirred up feelings, memories, maybe even a few tears, I want to invite you to share your story below. You don't need to make it poetic. Just speak from the heart. Has your relationship with your adult children changed over time? Have you ever felt disrespected or dismissed, and what helped you start to stand up inside again? What would you say to someone else going through the same thing? Your voice could be the one that helps another person feel a little less alone tonight. And if you found comfort in this space, if you felt seen, heard, understood, I'd love for us to stay connected. Go ahead and click the subscribe button if you haven't already. Not because you owe me anything, but because healing often happens in community. And here, we speak softly but honestly. We reflect deeply. We grow together. You have more power than you think. Not power to control others, but power to stand in who you are. With quiet pride, with gentle strength, with dignity that doesn't need to shout. Remember this: you are not a burden. You are a blessing. And the way forward isn't paved with complaints or conflict. It's lit by your decision to honor yourself. Thank you for sharing this space with me. And until we talk again, be kind to your heart. Be bold in your boundaries. And walk each day with the quiet certainty that you deserve love, not for what you do, but for who you are. Always